You can't just pack up and leave without paying us first." Those words sliced through the warm morning air like a rusty blade, sharp and irritating. I was halfway down my driveway, carrying the last heavy box from my living room to the bed of my old Ford pickup, when I looked up and saw her, Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of our HOA. She stood there in her pastel pink sweater, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon, her chin tilted up so high you'd think she was surveying a kingdom instead of a suburban cul-de-sac. Her voice had that nasal authority she loved to wield, the same tone she used when telling neighbors their fence was 1 inch too high or their lawn was a shade too yellow. I took a deep breath and set the box down on the truck bed, wiping the sweat from my forehead. I'd been planning this move for months, quietly and carefully, counting down the days until I could leave behind this nightmare of a neighborhood and the endless tyranny of HOA rules. The list of ridiculous infractions they'd fined me for over the years could fill a novel. One time, they fined me for having my porch light on too late at night, claimed it was light pollution. Another time, my kids left their bikes leaning against the garage for exactly 3 minutes while we unloaded groceries, and I got a written violation in the mail. They even told me the flowers in my front yard were not an HOA-approved color palette. Flowers. I'd been living in a prison disguised as a picturesque neighborhood. Now I was done. Sold the house. Signed every paper. Paid every legitimate bill. My name was officially off their books. All I had to do was load my truck, drive to my new cabin outside of HOA territory, and never look back. That thought alone had been the fuel that kept me sane during the moving process. But, of course, Karen had other plans. She took a few steps closer, her white sneakers crunching on the driveway gravel. "I'm going to need to see your final clearance payment," she demanded, tapping her clipboard like she was stamping out an arrest warrant. I frowned. "Final clearance payment? What are you talking about?" "It's standard HOA procedure when a resident moves out," she said, her eyes narrowing. "A $500 departure fee. Covers administrative costs, record closure, and community adjustments for your absence." She said it like I was some critical gear in the HOA machine and my leaving would cause the entire neighborhood to collapse. I couldn't help but laugh, not because it was funny but because it was so absurd. "There's no such thing as a departure fee, Karen. I've read the bylaws front to back. I paid my last month's dues when I closed the sale, and my HOA account is zeroed out." Her lips curled into that smug little smile she wore when she thought she had someone cornered. "You can either pay now, or I'll have no choice but to involve the authorities." I crossed my arms. "Involve them. Go ahead." That made her pause for just a second, probably because she was expecting me to panic. But I didn't. Instead, I picked up the box I'd set down and slid it deeper into the truck bed, making it clear that I wasn't about to play her game. I figured she'd huff, stomp off, maybe write me a fake, final notice, letter. But then she did something I didn't expect. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and started dialing. "Hello, yes, this is Karen Roberts, president of the Lakeside View HOA, she said, her voice already dripping with manufactured urgency. "I need an officer dispatched immediately. I have a man here attempting to leave without paying required HOA fees. Yes, that's theft. He's stealing from the community." I stood there, utterly amazed at her nerve. She wasn't just bending the truth, she was flat out fabricating a crime. Theft. I was moving my own belongings from my own property. It was like calling the police on someone for eating their own sandwich. She ended the call and shoved the phone back into her bag with the air of someone who had just set a master plan in motion. "They'll be here shortly," she said, like she was telling a child to sit in the corner and wait for punishment. "You really think the police are going to arrest me for moving out of my own house?" I asked. "I think," she said slowly, savoring each word, "that the police will do their job once they hear from the HOA president." That right there was Karen's biggest flaw. she truly believed the HOA was above the law. Years of unchecked power had convinced her that she was something more than a neighborhood busybody. She thought she was a law enforcement authority, a city inspector, and a judge all rolled into one. I leaned against the tailgate of my truck, arms still crossed, and gave her a long, calm look. "All right, Karen. Let's see how this goes." Her eyebrows rose slightly, as if she was trying to figure out why I wasn't sweating bullets. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have guessed, was that her little stunt was about to backfire spectacularly. Because while I didn't exactly have the police on speed dial, someone very close to me did. I grabbed my water bottle from the cab of the truck and took a sip, keeping my eyes on her as she pretended to review her clipboard. She was putting on a whole performance, pretending to check incident logs and payment records, as though the police would arrive and be dazzled by her administrative authority. 10 minutes later, the distant hum of an approaching engine reached my ears. Karen straightened her posture, clutching her clipboard tighter, and glanced toward the end of the street. A black and white cruiser slowly turned into the cul-de-sac. I could see the satisfaction blooming on her face. This was her big moment, the time she'd finally put me in my place, once and for all. She waved her arms dramatically as the cruiser approached, stepping right into the street to flag it down. "Officer! Over here," she called, her voice ringing with triumph. The patrol car rolled to a stop, and the officer inside stepped out, adjusting his belt. Karen wasted no time. She launched into her story, pointing at me like she'd just caught a fugitive. "That's him, officer. He's leaving without paying mandatory HOA fees. That's theft. I have all the records right here." I stayed right where I was, leaning on my truck, letting her dig her own grave. What she didn't know was that her little performance was about to have a very different ending than she imagined. Because behind that cruiser, just turning onto the street, was a second vehicle, one she definitely wasn't expecting to see. And when she saw who stepped out of it, her smug smile would vanish faster than a fine notice in a paper shredder. And that's when things got really interesting. The black and white cruiser had barely rolled to a stop when I noticed the second vehicle pulling in behind it, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. Karen, too busy gushing to the first officer about my supposed crime, didn't notice it at first. She was waving her clipboard in the air, flipping through pages like she was presenting evidence to the Supreme Court. The patrol officer listened with polite patience, though I could tell from his face that he wasn't convinced. He glanced over at me, and I simply raised my eyebrows, letting him know there was more to this story than Karen's dramatics. Then the SUV's door swung open. Out stepped my son, Daniel, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing his county sheriff's department uniform. The polished badge gleamed under the mid-morning sun, and the subtle clink of his duty belt was the only sound in the suddenly quiet cul-de-sac. His presence had that instant weight to it, the kind that made people straighten their backs and measure their words. Karen caught sight of him and froze mid-sentence, her mouth still half open. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head, trying to figure out if this was some kind of coincidence or a nightmare she'd just stepped into. "Dad? Everything okay here?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but edged with authority. I smiled. "Oh yeah, everything's fine. Just a little HOA drama. Karen here thinks I'm committing theft by moving my own stuff out of my own house." Karen blinked rapidly. "Wait, your son is law enforcement," Daniel finished for her, producing his badge and holding it up so there was no doubt. "And you just made a false report to the police. That's a criminal offense." Karen's face drained of color. I didn't mean." But Daniel had already stepped closer, his posture professional. "Ma'am, you called 911 and reported a crime you knew wasn't happening. That's misuse of emergency services and filing a false police report." Her voice cracked as she tried to regain control of the situation. "I'm the HOA president. It's my duty to enforce the rules. If someone leaves without paying. Daniel cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. The HOA is not a law enforcement agency. You don't have the legal authority to accuse someone of theft just because they won't pay a fee you made up. That's harassment. The first officer, still standing near the cruiser, stepped back slightly and let Daniel take over. I caught the faintest smirk on his face, like he'd been dealing with Karen for years and was quietly enjoying the show. Karen took a nervous step backward. Look, I was just trying to protect the community. You were trying to intimidate my father, Daniel said firmly. And you abused police resources to do it. Do you know how many real emergencies happen every day? Calls like yours waste valuable time and could put someone's life at risk. The neighbors had started to notice what was happening. Curtains were twitching, doors opening just a crack. Across the street, old Mr. Jenkins sat down on his porch with a cup of coffee like he'd just tuned into his favorite TV show. A couple of teenagers leaned on their bikes at the corner, eyes wide with curiosity. Karen's hand clutched the clipboard tighter, her knuckles white. You can't arrest me. This is a misunderstanding. I didn't lie to the police. Yes, you did, Daniel replied, his tone flat. You knowingly reported false information. That's a misdemeanor in this county, and in some cases, it can be a felony. You've also created a public disturbance and harassed a private citizen. That's 2 more charges right there. Karen's breathing quickened. This is insane. I'm the one who called you. I'm the victim here. You're not a victim, Daniel said. You're the instigator. And now you're under arrest. He reached for his cuffs, and that's when Karen's composure shattered. She stepped back quickly, nearly tripping over the curb. No. This isn't happening. I'm the HOA president. The board will hear about this, and they'll have your badge. Daniel didn't flinch. Ma'am, the law doesn't bend for HOAs. Now turn around and place your hands behind your back. The gasp that went through the neighborhood was almost theatrical. One of the teenagers actually whispered, "No way," like he couldn't believe he was witnessing this. Karen stood frozen for a moment, eyes darting between me, Daniel, and the patrol officer. Finally, she turned around slowly, muttering under her breath about how this was a massive overreaction. Daniel cuffed her with practiced efficiency, then guided her toward the black SUV. She looked over her shoulder at me with pure venom in her eyes, as if I'd betrayed some sacred pact. I just smiled and gave her a little wave. As she passed the patrol car, the first officer tipped his head toward me and murmured, "About time." Karen's voice rose again as Daniel opened the back door of the SUV. "You're making a mistake. You don't understand. This will ruin my reputation." Daniel kept his voice even. "Maybe you should have thought of that before calling 911 over a made-up crime." She sat down in the back seat, her body rigid, eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. Daniel shut the door gently but firmly. The sound of it locking seemed to echo through the street. For a moment, the only noise was the hum of the SUV's engine. Neighbors whispered among themselves. One woman down the block clapped softly, like she was trying not to be obvious but couldn't resist. Even the teenagers were grinning now. Daniel walked back over to me. "You okay, Dad?" "Never better," I said. I was just wondering how far she thought she could push it before someone called her out. "She's lucky this is just an arrest and not a court case yet," he said. "People like her think power means they can make their own laws. It doesn't work that way." Karen sat in the SUV, looking like she'd swallowed something sour. I could almost hear her mental gears turning, probably already planning her wrongful arrest speech for the next HOA meeting. But for now, she was quiet, and for the first time in years, so was the entire street. Daniel leaned closer and lowered his voice. "This won't be the last you hear from her. People like that, they don't quit. But now she knows there's a line she can't cross without consequences. I nodded. Good. Maybe that line will keep her on her side of the street from now on. The first officer joined us briefly, giving me a nod. She's been a problem for a while. I think this will finally slow her down. I watched as Daniel got back into his SUV, ready to take Karen downtown. She shot me one last glare through the tinted glass, but it didn't carry the same sting it used to. This time, she was the one trapped, and I was the one walking free. And just like that, the balance of power in the neighborhood shifted. The queen of the HOA had just been dethroned, and she hadn't even seen it coming. Karen's voice carried even through the SUV's closed window as Daniel began pulling away, her muffled protests sounding like the final act of a bad community theater play. She was leaning forward in her seat, trying to talk to him, probably thinking she could negotiate her way out of the cuffs. The neighbor's eyes followed the black SUV until it turned the corner and disappeared. The street, once buzzing with the tension she had stirred up, now seemed oddly peaceful. But the air still carried that electric charge you get after a lightning storm, like everyone knew something big had just happened. I stayed leaning against my truck for a moment, just soaking it all in. The woman who had written me up for improper lawn edging, and once told my wife that our wind chimes violated community sound regulations, was finally being held accountable. She wasn't the law here anymore, and for the first time in a long time, the block felt lighter. The first officer lingered near his cruiser, clearly in no rush to leave. He strolled over, lowering his voice so the onlookers wouldn't hear. You know, I can't tell you how many times we've been called out here for HOA nonsense. Always her. Always something that turns out to be nothing. But this, he glanced in the direction the SUV had gone. This is new. And honestly, long overdue. I chuckled. She really thought she could make up a fee and get me arrested for not paying it. The officer grinned faintly. That's the thing with people like her. They get so used to everyone backing down that they think they're untouchable. But call the wrong bluff, and, he made a quick snapping gesture with his fingers. It's over. By now, the neighbors were starting to emerge from behind their curtains. A few walked toward me casually, pretending they just happened to be out for a morning stroll. I could read the curiosity in their eyes. Mrs. Dalton from across the street, who once got a fine for planting the wrong type of hedges, approached with a half smile. Did she really just get arrested? I nodded, and her smile widened into something almost gleeful. Well, I never thought I'd see the day. She looked over her shoulder toward her house. I'm calling my sister. She won't believe this. Behind her, two younger neighbors, Kyle and Monica, were whispering excitedly. Kyle, who had been hit with a $150 noise violation for having his garage door open while working on his motorcycle, shook his head. Dude, she's been harassing people for years. And now she's in cuffs? Man, that's poetic. I didn't respond, but I couldn't help the small smirk tugging at my lips. As the crowd slowly dispersed, I climbed into the cab of my truck to rest for a bit before loading the last couple of boxes. I pulled out my phone, half expecting a text from Daniel. Sure enough, one popped up just as I unlocked the screen. She's being booked now. Charges: filing a false police report, harassment, misuse of emergency services. She's not happy about it. I laughed quietly to myself. If I knew Karen, she was probably pacing in some holding room, threatening to call every lawyer in the county, convinced she could HOA her way out of an actual criminal charge. Not 15 minutes later, I saw another vehicle I recognized, Daniel's SUV, returning to the neighborhood. But this time, Karen wasn't in it. Daniel parked beside my truck and got out, his face calm but with a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. She's in processing, he said, leaning on the truck bed. Took everything in me not to laugh when she tried to tell the desk sergeant she was the president of the community like it was some diplomatic title. I raised an eyebrow. How'd that go over? She got told to sit down and wait her turn, Daniel said, chuckling. She also demanded a phone call to the HOA board to rectify the situation. I told her the board doesn't have jurisdiction over the county jail. That mental image was enough to make me laugh harder than I had in weeks. What happens next? I asked. She'll get a hearing date. Best case scenario for her, she pays fines and gets probation. Worst case? A little county jail time. Either way, she's going to have to explain this to a judge. And the report clearly states she fabricated the charges against you. The satisfaction in his voice wasn't just professional, it was personal. Karen had pushed boundaries with me for years, but she'd also been a thorn in Daniel's side. Whenever he came to visit, she found some reason to remind us of HOA rules. Once, she even told him that his patrol car parked outside my house was lowering property values. I could see the relief in him now, knowing that the tables had finally turned. As we stood there, another neighbor, a middle-aged guy named Tom, came over from 2 houses down. He had a wide grin and a cell phone in hand. Hey, don't be mad, but I may have gotten that whole thing on video. I raised an eyebrow. The arrest? Everything, Tom said, his voice dropping conspiratorially. From when the cops first showed up to her getting cuffed. It's gold. My brother's already begging me to post it online. I laughed. If you post it, blur my face. Tom grinned. Done. But her? She's going viral, man. I'm telling you. The thought of Karen's HOA reign of terror being broadcast for the internet to dissect was tempting. Daniel shook his head but smirked. She's going to hate that. Which makes me like it even more. As the conversation wound down, Daniel gave me a quick pat on the shoulder. Finish your move. You're free from this place now. And if she tries anything else after she gets out, call me. I'll make sure it's handled. He got back in his SUV and headed out again, probably to return to the station. I stood there for a moment, looking around at the street that had been my prison for so long. Even the air felt different, lighter, freer. Without Karen looming over everything, the place almost looked normal. It struck me that this moment wasn't just about me moving out. It was a shift for everyone here. For years, they'd all lived under her thumb, afraid to push back. Now, they'd seen her in handcuffs. They'd seen that her power had limits. That she could be stopped. As I went back to loading the final boxes into my truck, I caught sight of Mrs. Dalton on her porch, giving me a little wave. Kyle and Monica were chatting animatedly by their driveway. Even old Mr. Jenkins was smiling to himself as he watered his flowers. Karen's reign had ended. And whether or not she came back after this, she'd never have that same untouchable authority again. That part of her story was over, and so was my time here. After Daniel left and the last bits of morning excitement faded, I took a deep breath and turned back to the task at hand, finishing my move. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, and a warm breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass from a few houses over. For the first time in years, I didn't feel that constant tension in my shoulders whenever I stepped outside. The kind of tension that came from never knowing when Karen would pop up with a new violation notice, or one of her trademark disapproving glares. I tossed the final 2 boxes into the back of my truck and shut the tailgate with a satisfying thud. This wasn't just a move, it felt like I was physically slamming the door shut on a chapter of my life I never wanted to revisit. As I tightened the straps over the load, I noticed something strange. The neighborhood was quiet. No barking orders from Karen, no HOA patrol walking around with clipboards, no passive-aggressive flyers stuffed in mailboxes. Just the normal sounds of a community going about its day. Mrs. Dalton waved at me from across the street. "You're really leaving, huh?" she called out. "Yep. Finally free, I replied, and she smiled in a way that said she understood exactly what that meant. "You'll love it out there by the lake," she said. "No one telling you what color your curtains have to be." I laughed. "That's the plan." As I climbed into the driver's seat, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Thought you'd like to know, she's not getting released today. Judge denied immediate bail due to repeated misuse of police resources. She's spending at least one night in county." I grinned, imagining Karen pacing in a holding cell, her mind racing through all the legal arguments she'd memorized from HOA bylaws that had absolutely no bearing in real court. She'd always carried herself like someone who could talk her way out of anything, but this time, there was no board meeting to stack in her favor, no fellow HOA cronies to back her up, no ability to slap a fine on a judge. I started the engine and let it idle for a moment, just taking in the view one last time. For all the trouble it had brought me, this street did hold some good memories: barbecues with the few decent neighbors, watching my kids learn to ride their bikes, planting that first garden before Karen decided my flowers were the wrong color. But those good moments had been overshadowed by years of petty harassment and power tripping. Now, I finally had the power to leave it all behind. As I eased the truck down the street, I caught sight of Tom again, still holding his phone like it was a winning lottery ticket. He gave me a knowing nod and mouthed, "It's online." I didn't even need to ask what he meant. Karen's arrest was probably already making its way through social media, gathering likes and comments from locals who had their own stories about her. The idea of her seeing herself in a viral video was just the cherry on top. I turned the corner and left the cul-de-sac behind, the houses shrinking in my rearview mirror until they disappeared entirely. The drive to my new place wasn't long, but each mile felt like I was shedding another layer of frustration, another memory of HOA nonsense. By the time I reached the winding road leading to the lake, my chest felt lighter, my breathing easier. When I pulled into the driveway of my new cabin, I just sat there for a moment, staring at the view. The water glimmered under the sun, framed by tall pines swaying gently in the breeze. There wasn't a single, private property, HOA enforcement sign in sight. No patrol cars doing slow rolls to make sure everyone's lawn looked uniform. Just peace. I stepped out and stretched, feeling the kind of calm I hadn't experienced in years. Out here, if I wanted to paint my porch neon green, I could. If I wanted to leave my fishing gear on the dock overnight, no one would write me up. And if anyone did try, well, I had Daniel on speed dial. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the water gold, Daniel called. "She's been officially charged," he said, a note of finality in his voice. "Judge wants her to appear in 2 weeks. Given her history, I wouldn't be surprised if they slapped her with some hefty fines and community service." I couldn't help but chuckle. "Think she'll be picking up trash in an orange vest around the neighborhood she used to run? Wouldn't that be poetic?" Daniel replied, laughing. "She might even have to wave at you if you visit." I leaned back in my chair on the porch, the sound of gentle waves lapping against the shore filling the quiet. "I'm good right here," I said. "I think I've had enough HOA drama to last me a lifetime." We talked for a few more minutes before hanging up, and as I sat there, I realized something important. Karen had spent years trying to control every aspect of my life in that neighborhood, but in the end, she'd only managed to push me into a better one. That day had started like any other moving day: boxes, packing tape, a little bit of stress, but it ended with the kind of poetic justice you rarely see outside of movies. Karen had called the cops thinking she could scare me into submission, but instead, she'd been the one in cuffs. The queen of the HOA dethroned by her own arrogance. As the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear, I took a deep breath of the crisp evening air. Out here, the only rules were the ones I set for myself. No one to fine me for hanging lights after dark. No one to tell me what color to paint my mailbox. No one to demand a departure fee for leaving. Karen would have her day in court, and maybe she'd walk away with a lighter sentence, or maybe she'd face real consequences for the first time in her life. Either way, it wasn't my problem anymore. I picked up my coffee mug, took a sip, and let the quiet settle in around me. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next confrontation. I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I was free, truly free. And somewhere, back in that neatly trimmed neighborhood, Karen was realizing the same thing I already knew. When you build your power on fear and intimidation, it only takes one moment, one bad decision, for it all to come crashing down. I smiled to myself, watching the reflection of the moon dance across the lake. Freedom, it turned out, looked a lot like this.